This here is the PowKiddy RGB30, and this is easily one of my favorite handhelds ever, with a square display, a pretty decent control layout, and just overall an extremely lovable device. As you might be able to tell, I've modded this current white model into oblivion, and I have a video all about that on the channel, which I'll link on screen now. With this model I've replaced the face buttons, I've installed vibration motors, and I've fixed the D-pad. And at this point in time I'm pretty happy overall with where this RGB30 is. So, of course, it's time to mod another. And so here we have the purple model of RGB30. And I personally have never seen a video of this device before, so this might be your first time seeing it. It's a really cool looking device, but a little odd as well. The actual color here is kind of like a purple rather than pink. And the black buttons is kind of an odd choice too. As I say repeatedly, pink and white is a totally untapped market in retro handhelds, but we won't go into that now. For this mod in particular, we are going to be changing out the D-pad and the face buttons, and installing this, which is an RGB Flex PCB. Basically, you solder this on to the motherboard of the RGB30, and these LEDs will light up and shine through the buttons. But of course these buttons are solid black, so we're not going to be able to see any light through those. So instead, we're going to be using these crystal transparent face buttons. And these are basically crystal clear buttons with this kind of rainbow shining glitter inside. They look fantastic and they should pair perfectly with this Flex PCB. Before I go any further though, I want to thank the creators of this amazing DIY project. This is a three-way collaboration between my friend Gameboy Juntaro, who dreamed up this idea, Ocelo, who created the Flex PCB itself, and did a bunch of the design work, and Mr. Various, who created the custom buttons. These three came together to create a really amazing mod for the RGB30, and this is a wonderful example of fan ingenuity. An idea, an execution, and a collaboration came together to make something, well, quite spectacular. So great work to these three, and thank you very much for sending me one of your kits to try out. One disclaimer I want to mention is that I have received a special edition model of the Flex PCB that has pink LEDs. However, unfortunately you won't be able to buy this one in particular. You will be able to buy the red, green, blue, yellow, or white edition though, along with any of Mr. Various's transparent or translucent buttons. I'm going to leave some links in the description box below which will show you how to buy these kits if you want to, and I definitely recommend checking them out. I'll also leave a link to Juntaro's blog where he's detailed the creation process of this PCB, and also a link to a post where my friend Pari Ume installed these buttons herself, and she details her experience as well. And without further ado, let's go ahead and begin the mod. To complete this mod, you're going to need a Phillips screwdriver with a small yet slightly long bit, just like this iFixit one here. And then you'll need some plastic opening tools. A pair of tweezers is definitely going to come in handy as well. And then you will of course need a soldering iron and the associated accessories like solder, an iron cleaning tip, perhaps some flux and stuff like that. And finally, I strongly recommend having some kind of container to keep your screws separated. There are only 3 different sizes of screws in this build, but you definitely don't want to mess them up. I'm using the lid of my iFixit toolkit, which has these little compartments for each different type of screw. Perfect. And so with all of that on hand, we're ready to begin the mod. First I'll set my RGB30 upside down, on top of a clean and soft cloth to prevent the screen from getting scratched. Well, I didn't do this because I always forget, but you should do that if you're doing this mod. Next we'll simply unscrew the 4 Phillips screws on the back of the device. And then we'll use a simple plastic opening tool to pry open the back of the case. This is pretty easy if you start from the top and just work your way around gently. It should pop off pretty easily after a few moments. However, don't pull the back all the way off just yet because we need to disconnect some cables. The first one you want to disconnect is the battery cable. Always disconnect the battery first and reconnect the battery last. Anyway, next we'll remove the 2 speaker cables. You can just wiggle these out gently, but don't pull too hard upwards on the wires themselves. And then finally we'll just pop off the antenna cable. With the back cover totally removed, be sure to place it somewhere safe and away from any source of heat or puncture. Also, if you lift the RGB30 up and flip it over, be careful because all of the shoulder buttons are just going to fall straight out. With the motherboard exposed, the first thing we need to do is to remove the 2 analog sticks. There are 2 FPC connectors, where these little flat FPC cables connect. You'll want to use a tool or your fingernail to flip up the black connection part, and then just slip the cable out. I use my tweezers with the rubber cap still on just to lever the cables out. These are very delicate, so just be careful. Next we'll just undo the 2 screws in each corner of the analog stick. And then the stick itself will just lift out of the case. With the 2 steps removed, the next thing that we want to do is to disconnect the display cable. This is the big ribbon cable in the center here. Just flip up this black part here, and then gently lever the cable out. Once again, this cable is very delicate, so just don't use anything sharp to pull it out. I ended up using the head of my Phillips screwdriver to just go in between the cable and slip it out. And now it's time to remove the screws that hold the PCB down into the case. And there are 8 of these and they're all the same size, so just take them out one by one and then put them in a safe place. With that done, the PCB will just lift out of the front of the case. Just be careful that the display cable doesn't get caught as you lift it out. I just wanted to take a look at Mr. Various's buttons here, so I pulled out the rubber membranes and removed the existing D-pad and face buttons. Then it was just a case of putting the new buttons and D-pad in and reattaching the membranes, which go on these 4 posts. Of course this will just fall out if you lift it up, so just hold it in. I was just curious to see what these would look like at this point, and suffice to say I was very happy with them. The quality in this glittery effect is just fantastic. I absolutely love them. Anyway, now we'll just put this front cover away, somewhere where the screen won't get scratched, because now we're just going to be working on the PCB. First I'll remove the flex PCB from its cardboard back. Now if you're doing this, make sure that you don't twist, bend, tug or anything like that, because this PCB can be very, very delicate. Just pull it up from the tape itself. And just be really careful because you just don't want to rip this. Now we'll overlay the flex PCB onto the motherboard itself. The fully circular holes go over the face button contacts, and the half circle holes go over the D-pad. By the way, this half circle hole thing is actually the D-pad fix for the RGB30 built into this PCB. So if you have any Captain tape to fix your D-pad on your RGB30, you can take it off now. This will do the job even better than that. Again, this is just a really ingenious design. Anyway, we're going to use the tape here to anchor the PCB down in the correct position. Start by anchoring one side of the PCB using the tape. You want to try and center the holes over the contacts as much as possible. Make sure that the tape is really nice and secure, and if you need to use your own masking or painter's tape, go ahead and get some. Then be sure to anchor down the other side too. Now bear in mind that the PCB itself may flex a little in the middle, it doesn't lay completely flat. And that's completely fine as long as the contacts are in the right place. Spend a little bit of time making sure yours is perfect before you continue. And then it's time to solder. Grab your iron and some solder, and the first thing that we're going to do is to solder down the 2 anchor points on the left hand side of the PCB. With this first one, be very careful that you don't touch the LED that's right above it, because that will actually burn the LED out and stop it from working. I suggest using a soldering iron with a sharp point that's at a slight bend, just like this, so that you can keep it well out of the way of the LED. And what we want to do here is to melt some solder through the ring onto the contact on the motherboard, and up over the ring itself. This will not only anchor the PCB in place, but it also acts as the ground connection. And then we'll simply do the same thing with the second anchor point right next to that. Next up, we're going to add a little blob of solder to this contact here. It's right at the bottom of the PCB. This will help us to solder on the wire in just a second. This is the wire here and it's included with the PCB. Bear in mind that the casing on this wire is not heat resistant, so it might melt if you touch the soldering iron to it too much. So just be a little careful of not melting the cover off. Because this wire is so small, we're going to hold it with some tweezers and then solder one end into that blob that we just put on the board. And then we're going to solder the other end of the wire into the 3v3 point on the PCB. I forgot to show this, but you need to add a little bit of solder to this point before you attach the wire. And with that done, the job's a good one. Or at least it should be. You can test it by plugging the RGB30 into power. The LED should light up along with the LED for the device itself. However, mine here didn't. It took me a little troubleshooting, but I realized that my ground solder point wasn't fully connected, and it was basically loose from the board. So after unplugging the device, I tried to reflow that solder by holding the PCB down with some tweezers to make sure it had a good connection. And there we go, plugging the device in again, it lights up just as expected. And these LEDs look amazing, don't they? The shade of pink is really nice, and I think it'll go really well with the purple shell. By the way, note that to test this, you do actually need an SD card inserted. If you don't have the SD card inserted, the LEDs will not light up quite as much. Anyway, I switched off my lights so that hopefully you could get a better look at the LEDs, and I think they look absolutely stunning. I cannot wait to reassemble this. Now that the board is anchored down and soldered on, we can permanently stick the PCB down. Firstly, we'll peel back the pink tape. Now you'll notice that the left hand side is already stuck in place, and that's because we anchored it down with those solder points. But the right hand side is still loose. So I'm going to peel back the tape here, and then I'll use this small dot of double-sided tape that was included with the kit. I'm just going to place that in the center of the buttons on the motherboard, and then I'll very carefully position the PCB, and then push it down onto the double-sided tape so that it sticks. It doesn't matter if little parts of this are flaring upwards away from the motherboard, because they'll be pressed flat by the membranes anyway, but just make sure it's as central as you can, and then peel off and discard any remaining pink or masking tape. So like the smart and intelligent man that I am, I grabbed a microfiber cloth and put it down on my work surface before placing the RGB30 screen down on it. Of course I already had the Mr. Various buttons in here, so I'm ready to reassemble. I'm just going to lower the PCB into place, ensuring that the display cable comes up through its slot. Then I'll reconnect the ribbon cable, and then I'll re-add those 8 screws holding the PCB down. With those screws inserted, I can properly check out these buttons and see how they feel, and trust me, they feel great. I noticed that the PCB wire was sticking out a little bit, so I just tucked it underneath the board. Now I thought that this device would look really good with some white analog sticks, so I bought some off of Amazon. And these will install in the exact same way as the original analog sticks did. I'll reattach the ribbon cable, push them down into place, and then screw them in with those 2 screws. Just be careful you don't over tighten these screws because they can split the plastic on the analog stick. So once you have some feedback from the screw, just stop there. As long as it's in tightly, that's all that matters. You don't need to overdo it. And as I thought, the white analog sticks look perfect. This looks absolutely fantastic so far. Next we'll add in the shoulder buttons again, making sure that we put them in the right place. Remember that R1 and R2 go on the left side from this perspective. And now we'll re-add the back cover. Remember what I said earlier, we reconnect the battery last. So I'll start with the antenna cable, which just pushes into place, then the 2 speaker cables, and then finally the battery. Now I'll just press the back cover back into place and it should pop on just fine. Now if you're a smart and intelligent person, unlike me, you'll power this on right now to test that everything's working before you screw on the back cover. But whatever, I just re-added these 4 screws. And then after a quick clean of the screen, my RGB30 mod is complete. And I cannot tell you that I was so happy with how this looked at this point. It looks absolutely beautiful. And powering it on, everything worked perfectly. Now something to note is that the RGBs are actually quite subtle when these buttons are in, and it's pretty hard to pick it up on camera how it looks in real life, especially with the daylight and my artificial lights all going on at once. So I thought I would take it to a few locations around my home so that you could see what it looks like. In a bright environment like my living room with the sunlight coming in, the LEDs shine up just enough to illuminate the buttons a little bit, which just makes them kind of stand out. It's not distracting while you're playing a game though, and it looks absolutely amazing. But when you get to a lesser lit environment, these glow and they look absolutely beautiful. What I really like is that if anything, the glow actually just attenuates the glitter inside the button. So rather than just getting like a blinding light in your face, you're getting a lot of patterns and diffracted light inside the button, and it honestly looks absolutely beautiful. And combined with a purplish theme, this is the retro neon theme, and a suitable Game Boy palette, I think this whole thing comes together perfectly. And that's especially when I place it on this amazing quilt that Mrs. Breeze just bought for us. And so there we have it. An incredible LED Flex PCB for the PowKiddy RGB30. I want to say a huge thank you to Juntaro, Ocelo, and Mr. Various for bringing this project to life. I think it's incredible that a bunch of fans of this device got together and made such an awesome mod. So a huge thank you to them, and I definitely look forward to seeing what they bring next. Please check out the links in the description box below for some insight on how this was created and of course how to buy it yourself. You may need to use a proxy shipping service to get one from Japan, but if you want it, it's well worth the time and effort. And now this particular RGB30 is going back in the box, and I'll give it to my daughter after she's born, plus maybe like 5 or 6 years when she's old enough.